It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to look at UFC pay. And we are also going to look at some PFL stuff and some Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis stuff. We're even going to talk about Triller. But before we get into all that, I have two suggestions for you. First, you should go back to our very previous episode, the one right before this one, episode 182, because one, it's 100% free. But two, and most importantly, the content contained within is super, super valuable content. We have two powerful attorneys. We have Patrick English, who helped craft the Ali Act with, rest in peace, Mr. Senator John McCain. And we have Jim Quinn, who is known as a super attorney. He has represented all the players' associations for all the major stick and ball sports. So if you ever really want to hear from the experts, this is your chance. And remember, we made this episode free. So please go get in on that. The other thing I want to advise you on is to subscribe and to do it with your money, with your wallet, because we do paywall some of our content. And if you want access to all of that content, you're going to have to subscribe with your wallet. Now, John, how the heck are you?
Pretty good. Thanks for pitching our last episode. I'm a little disappointed that we cut short on James Quinn. There's probably another 15 minutes that we recorded that for technical difficulties didn't make it to the show. So maybe we'll get him on in the future and we can make up for that.
Ooh, that would be awesome. I love that idea. How else are you? How soon are we out from you going back home to California?
Well, this is my last week in Minnesota. I head back to LA next week on Tuesday. So that'll be my first day back. And then I go back hiatus. My job is no longer on hiatus. I'll be back at the office next week. So I am not, so I feel like a kid. Summer's over. This is really depressing.
Oh no, back to work. And folks, we might be posting episodes just here, there, and everywhere until John gets his routine back down. So we'll still be giving you a couple episodes a week, but the days might change. So look out for that. John, are you ready to get down to brass tacks?
You know damn well I'm not, but let's do it.
All right. There have been some new filings in the antitrust case. First, which antitrust case? And second, what are these filings?
Well, technically, it's the three antitrust cases that are still going on right now for Johnson v. Zuffa, Sirkinoff v. Zuffa, and Davis v. Zuffa. Because if you remember, all three are related. They're kind of tied together. And so they're filing, most of these files have to relate to all of them. And what has been filed recently in the last week or so, there was a joint status report, which is a summary between the plaintiffs and defendants of where they're at. There was a plaintiff's reply memorandum for motion to compel. This was directed at Dominance MMA. It's actually a fun read if you get a chance. You get on Pacer, get a copy and read it, because they kind of go after Dominance about, you're kind of full of shit. You do have to comply to this. We'll see if the judge upholds that. Then they filed a reply in support of plaintiff's motion to sanction, which is the plaintiffs are asking the judge that if Endeavor and TKO and them do not engage in good faith discovery, that they want the judge to issue a sanction. Then there's a plaintiff's motion to seal certain, or defendant's motion, to seal certain exhibits. The defendants don't want certain things released to the public, so they're asking for that. And then there's Zuffa's certificate of interested parties, which basically lists that TKO and Endeavor are both interested parties in the case. And finally, there's an August 26th hearing coming up as well. So tomorrow there will be a hearing to settle a lot of this stuff. Finally, there was a letter, I say for last, from Berger Montague about the filing. This is from the plaintiffs. And this is kind of interesting because what they're asking is that the defendants, they're claiming this is about the defendant's discovery. This is about this basically the plaintiff saying the defendants are arguing, the defendants being Zuffa, UFC, that they do not have access to some of the items. They don't have access to like Nikisa Badarian and Marshall Zelznick, who used to be former employees. We don't have access to their cell phone, things like that. We don't. You'd have to deal with them directly. We have no contact with these people. But as the defendants notice, Zuffa proposed back earlier this year that Chad Hurley, Marshall Zelznick, and Nikisa Badarian as the custodians. In other words, the people to kind of handle the discovery for the defendant side and to hand it over to the control the discovery to hand over to the plaintiffs. And so they make note of that it's kind of absurd that you guys could make the argument that you have no access contact to these people, yet these very people who we're trying to get information on, you're proposing that they be the custodians. So I thought that was interesting as well. But again, tomorrow's the big hearing. Let's see if anybody shows up. I, unfortunately, because I'm in Minnesota watching my mom, will not go to Vegas for this. I am waiting to see if news that anybody in Vegas will be at the hearing. If you hear this, because we post in the morning and you're in Vegas and you want to show up to this hearing live, and so maybe you can tell us what transpires afterwards, please let us know if you're going. I guess I will send a message out to Paul Gift to see if he goes, but I haven't heard news from any media member in Vegas yet that they'll be attending, but I hope someone's there so we can get news of what happens.
Absolutely. Next up, the UFC pay has once again come under fire on social media after Charles Johnson talked about how he was broke despite fighting frequently, like 3 times a year, and that the $50,000 bonus that he got on Saturday for taking out Loner Kavanaugh, who is a very, very highly touted prospect. I mean, Charles Johnson has become the prospect killer. But anyways, he talked about how his bank account was in the negative. He was in the red. His manager, Brian Butler, even said that he had loaned Charles money ahead of the fight this past Saturday night. So I need you to weigh in on this debate because there's a lot of people out there that are saying some odd things. So let's hear what you have to say.
Well, I mean, first, it's hard to weigh in without knowing all the information because one thing about athletes, it is true, we do not know his exact earnings. Now, if we go through this typical UFC contract and we look at the points where they usually offer you a new deal, so we're just following the standard, he probably, counting that last fight, has earned in his career anywhere from $500,000 to $600,000. That's over, I think, a 4-year career he's had in the UFC. So that people will say, well, that's a lot of money compared to the typical worker. But people also always forget that this is gross, not net. They're independent contractors. They have expenses. So you take a great chunk of that away before you even see it. So people might look at that still and say, even in that case, well, he should have enough to live on. That's possibly true, too. But again, we don't know the circumstances of each fight, of his finances at the time. It's possible, again, we don't know. It's possible he blew the money. It's possible he has a gambling problem. It's possible he's an alcoholic. It's possible, there are tons of possibilities. But it's also very possible that he's not awful with his money, but because the way the fight business works, because it's based on, you can't really plan ahead. And I believe he was coming off a loss the previous fight, was he not?
Yes.
I could be mistaken.
That's right. Yeah.
So if we let's look at his record really quick. We're going to look up on Charles Johnson, UFC, I guess I'll go to Wikipedia. It's probably the fastest way to get to it. Hopefully that's accurate. Wikipedia, some people I do not always trust, but I think on this case. So, okay, if we go through, he fought in the last 12 months, since October 2024. He's fought 1 time until this fight. So, one thing the fans, I think they might miss is that, yes, on paper, he's averaging, let's say, $100,000 to $150,000 a year. But again, that's gross, not net. And on top of that, there is a long period that can happen between his fights. He has no control when his next fight's being booked. So people are like, oh, he's been booked 3 times to fight. He was booked 3 times to fight, 4 times actually in 2024. And maybe he got thinking in his head that I will have more consistent fights going forward. And then all that happened is over the next 12 months, he got one additional fight until now. Well, that can, these guys, again, they're not making tons of money. They do not have tons of monies in the savings. He has a kid on the way.
He has other kids too.
He has other kids. There's expenses that take that up. So that can eat into that. And again, we're not talking, we're talking middle class to upper middle class wages for a short period of time. An early part of his career, he was not making that. So that can disappear quickly. Also, you got to remember that if he loses a fight, and I'm guessing he's around 35 and 35 or 40 and 40 in that ballpark based on the standard career progression and contracts. That's just a ballpark figure. I could be wrong, but I'm guessing he's around that. Well, there's a big difference on his last fight when he lost between getting 40,000 and getting 80,000, right? There's the huge difference in your income at that point. So I think that's what people missing. And I know there's a lot of arguments that shows how underpaid UFC fighters are. And I don't think you can ever take a specific case and say that proves it. But in this case, he is not, he is on an extended period of wins after he had a long streak of losses. Some ways he's lucky to be in the UFC at that point. But since then, he's gone on a long streak of wins. He's like, 6 of his last 7 fights. So he's a very quality opponent. I don't know where he's currently ranked, but you would think that someone of kind of his progression would be getting he wouldn't be getting millions. He wouldn't be getting vast sums of money, but he does serve a function with considering how much the UFC makes and the value he provides that you would want to put him in a position where he could negotiate a higher purse. So, again, I probably didn't really answer it to anybody's, the way they would like me to have answered. I'm sure I failed on every party's interest in this. Those that think he doesn't deserve anything to those that think he deserves a lot more. But just from my point of view is, again, we can't say for sure, has he been blowing his money or not. But at the same time, I think it does show that the ecosystem, the social economic system, I should say, that they put in place for MMA, for how much money it's generating, we haven't designed it properly. We haven't designed it good enough where the fighters that are providing the value to most of us are seeing a large chunk of that money. And so I think there's ways we could probably try to fix that, or at least attempt to. And we haven't even attempted it. The result is fighters like Charles Johnson, waiting to get, waiting for every fight to break even.
I have some bounce backs for you.
Go ahead, fire away.
1, he's ranked number 15. 2, I want to know if the current economic status that the United States is in, where that everything has gone up exponentially from groceries to clothing, every little thing, cars, etc., if that could figure in. Also, since he had that string of losses just a couple years ago, how much would that have affected his escalator? And finally, the fact that he's a flyweight, would that have affected his purses and that escalator to begin with?
Yeah, the flyweight one to start with. I'll start backward, going backwards. The flyweight definitely would impact it. Flyweights make less than the other weight classes. It goes by the higher the weights you are, generally the more pay you get. The lower the weight, the lower the pay, the slower you are to move on to the next contract. The more willing they're to keep you at a lower contract. When you get up to your championship level, the standard championship level. Now there's always unique cases for every weight class. If you're a fighter that's, Conor McGregor was not making what the typical 145 was making at that time. And so in this case, but flyweights generally have the lowest base for the championships, the flat rate plus pay-per-view points, which now don't really matter. So yeah, that would probably play a part. The losses played a part because that freezes your contract at that point. And so the escalator doesn't start again. And I'm sure they kept him on that contract instead of negotiating a new contract during that loss period. So that probably locked him into I think during that period, he was probably on a second, based on the number of fights he has, probably his second UFC contract. Typically, if he started 12-12, let's say, at 12 and 12. It would then go, 12 and 12, 14, 14, 16, 16, and somewhere around the fourth fight or so, they would start negotiating a new contract. He gets to the next one that starts around 22,000, I think it is at this point. And then he would have been stuck there for a while. And so that definitely played a part too. And so all that, now the other expenses, inflation obviously eats into people's pay, but another big cost. He has a kid coming. Did he buy a house? This is something that's really making a real big division in America, because interest rates were super low for a long time, and a lot of people bought houses with low interest rates. Means that their mortgage payments are low compared to everybody else. And now that the mortgage rates have skyrocketed, if you've gotten a house in the last couple of years, you are paying a much, much larger amount on your mortgage. Your house has probably gone up in value too. So house is more expensive. So you had to take out a bigger loan, paying more on your interest on that loan for that house, which means you have much less disposable income and you're much more in a precarious situation than other people. So that's also a possibility. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that would not be shocking, because that hurts a lot of people. We have a situation in America now. We have a big divide between those that have a house with a low interest rate and they're not moving out now because they do not want to get a new loan. And so they're sitting on that house, making it, there's less property available for others to buy. And those that have to buy a house at inflated, much higher interest rates. So that's another strong possibility. So all those, I think I answered all of them, I hope. All those could have an impact on the situation.
I misspoke earlier. I said that he had other kids. He does not. This will be his first kid. So with you discussing buying a house or staying in a house, I think that is a big factor.
And there's other expenses too. If his wife is pregnant, was she working before? Yeah. Is she not working now? She's pregnant. Scale back her out. The doctor payments, what's covered. Remember, UFC fighters do not have health insurance. They're paying for themselves. So what insurance do they have for, to help cover for pregnancy? There's a lot of unanswered questions here, but a lot of expenses a UFC fighter could have that are much higher than the typical worker might face.
Chase Hooper chimed in on this and discussed how very easy it is to be in that situation without, quote, blowing your money, as some have suggested is the culprit of financial instability with other fighters. What did you think of his breakdown of the expenses?
Well, I thought it was pretty good, pretty fair. His breakdown was, he listed that there's 10% that has to go to the coaches, 15% to the manager, 30% to federal taxes, another 5% to state income tax. And so that's fairly accurate in some ways. It's a little off on some things, but it goes to, but it's good to point out one thing is that when people see what a fighter makes, like, oh, he made 3 fights last year and he made $500,000. Again, that is gross. That's his gross income. He is an independent contractor. So that income is like he's a small business. You have to deduct your expenses first, and fighters have sizable expenses. Now, the amount he had to coaches, to managers are accurate, but there's additional expenses on top of that. I mean, a lot of fighters feel the need because and part of this has to do with the fact you're in the UFC. This is your last, this is the pinnacle, and also the only place you can really progress your career, right? So the last thing you want to do is lose in the UFC, because it could be just detrimental to your career ascension. So fighters are much more willing to do additional expenses, like bring in sparring partners that are and also specific sparring partners that are highly skilled, because they feel the need that they have to, because that's how they compete with their opponent. They also fly maybe an extra coach out because they want someone to be in charge of the grappling and someone in charge of the striking. So they pay these extra prices that the UFC does not cover. All that adds up. So those are additional deductions. So even though he lists, I think it was, I think he has 60% of the income is taken from it. It might even be higher than that. And he also makes a mistake here, though, I think a lot of people do, is that you should always deduct your expenses. After expenses are deducted, then you apply the taxes. The taxes, people always have this thing where they say taxes, my total pay, I have to pay like 40% of the taxes. You pay after your expenses. But again, UFC fighters have large expenses, all that training. Additionally, they're independent contractors, so they have to get their own health insurance. I am sure health insurance is not cheap for people that punch each other in the head. Probably have to get family insurance to cover your other members of your family. You have to pay your payroll taxes, as you know, because employees, if you work for a company, you might forget this or take this for granted. They cover a portion of your payroll taxes, half of it. And so if you're an independent contractor, you have to personally deduct an additional 5% from your payroll taxes to cover that. So that adds more to your taxes. So just a lot more expenses. But, I thought it was fair. And it's always something we bring up on the show a lot, is that when we talk about fighter pay, when we talk about what fighters are getting paid, you got to remember that's gross, not net. It's what they got before their expenses. They have to handle all their own expenses themselves. So fighters are making much, much less than what the purse numbers are showing, especially those towards, in the undercard, because it's very possible that they have budgeted half their fight purse for their training and getting ready for the fight and their expenses on that. And yet if they don't win, that means the entire purse is going to be eaten up. The entire show payment is going to be eaten up by those expenses, and they all made nothing on that fight.
Aljamain Sterling quoted Chase Hooper and basically agreed with his assessment. And then he also discussed on Ariel Helwani's show how he was not happy that his fight was 5 rounds instead of 3, and that he wasn't getting extra pay for the extra rounds. But his manager, Tiki Gossin, also represented Brian Ortega, and many surmise that Tiki was more in Brian Ortega's corner than in Aljo's, because a 5-round fight benefited Ortega more than it would have benefited Aljo. At least that was the theory at the time. How much culpability does Tiki Gossin have in all of this, as far as 5 rounds and no extra pay?
Well, first I want to comment something Sterling said. He said, we're not MLS. In his reply, I should say, to Chase Hooper, if people are listening. In his reply, he said, we are not MLS players. And I couldn't figure out if he meant Major League Sports or Major League Soccer.
He was talking Major League Soccer.
Well, because Major League Soccer, actually, their wage share, as I talked to James Quinn about, is not that much greater than MMA fighters, UFC fighters, because they play, I should say, for a single entity monopoly, and they have that having a monopoly over North American soccer in that region, but they pay only a little bit more than the UFC. So
do you think they know that though?
No, I don't think. I think people don't know that. I thought for sure he was talking about Major League Sports, but
no,
okay,
he was talking Major League Soccer.
All right, well that's understandable. That's something you expect from an MMA fighter to say, I guess. But going back to Tiki, one thing he's a good friends with Dana White, long time. People might forget that. Another thing is, one of my favorite Tiki Gossin things is he was mentioned in Wayne Harriman's the court documents in the case against Wayne Harriman when he was charged with drug smuggling, and Tiki was mentioned of that when they were supposedly dealing with bikers, negotiating over cocaine. There was a settlement on that, a negotiated settlement with the feds with Wayne Harriman, so nothing became of that. But I just always thought that was a nice cameo by Tiki in that one. But in this situation, in this case right here, I do not know for fact that this would benefit Brian Ortega, but that's very possible. That is very possible. But Sterling's right a couple of things. One is, and this is a complaint that Dan Hooker had a few weeks ago about the fact that they wanted to book him for a 5-round fight, and he was only going to get $25,000 extra. Well, that's the bonus. That $25,000 bonus, that tiny bonus, is what you get for main eventing, which I can't believe they still have that, because that was the bonus they had almost 10 years ago. Apparently, it hasn't increased in those 10 years. And so to go from a 3 to a 5-round fight main event, you only get $25,000 extra dollars. In his case, it's a co-main. And so if it wasn't a main event, he gets no extra money. And so you're asking fighters to get into a much tougher fight, 40% longer, so that's two extra rounds, which is, I shouldn't say it's 40% longer. That is 2/3 longer than the 3-round fight. So that's a tremendous amount of extra time, a tremendous amount of extra punishment for the same purse. So it's really not worth it. And yet, for some reason, Sterling agreed to it, and some reason his management agreed to it. So I would definitely have some questions for my management why we were agreeing to this without negotiating a higher purse, especially since I have you as my management because you're good buddies with Dana White. At least that's my suspicion. I suspect that Sterling got Tiki as his management because he is in good relationship with Dana White, just like a lot of fighters go to Ali Abdelaziz, because as people familiar with the sport are probably aware, Sterling was on the outs with the UFC for a while. He gets someone that's on good relation to him to kind of smooth it over, and this person is agreeing stuff that does not seem to be in his best interest. Well, then I would question if they're following their fiduciary responsibility. And it kind of shows you the catch-22 I think a lot of fighters find themselves is that some argue you do not need a manager, but for some fighters, you cannot get in the UFC without a manager. Without the right manager too, you do not have someone that's in such good graces with the UFC. Not the fighter at the good graces, the manager is, that he can actually get you the fights you want because they have access to phone. They can call the matchmakers and have good relations with them. At the same time, you are paying these guys for the access and not for them to do their fiduciary responsibility, which is to look out for your career. And in this case, there are some questions that maybe he was looking out for the other fighter. So, what can I tell Sterling? It's hard. It's hard to know what to tell him because, again, you weigh all those problems. Which one is more important to your career right now? Are you concerned that your relationship with the UFC is so bad that you need Tiki there to smooth it over? Or are you more worried about the fact that he might not be looking out for your best interests, especially when you are paying him I don't know the percentage, but the typical one is about 15%. So let's say 15%. That's a sizable amount of your purse.
There are a lot of folks that are blaming fighters for their predicament. But doesn't it mainly come down to the promoter having such a stranglehold on the sport that there are really no other options?
Yeah, actually, that's a big problem with it because you would think you would have management. If you're talking about the problem with management,
I'm
not
talking about all of it, that they're low paid and that they have shitty managers.
Well, yeah. I mean, it all goes hand in hand. If you have, I know some people are arguing with me on Twitter that UFC is not a monopoly, not a monopsony, unless you're being, unless you're trying to play semantics where you're pointing out that it's not monopoly, but monopoly power or monopsony power we're talking about. Okay, fine. We can go play semantics and say that's true, although it's very accepted to just use the term monopoly. But I think if you look at the evidence, that the fact that we had an antitrust case, the UFC settled for $375 million, accusing them of monopsony power, that the judge in this federal case ruled a class cert that suggested there was evidence that they had monopsony power, that the UFC engages in behavior that the International Boxing Club of New York was found to be abusing to become a monopoly back in the 50s, and that the Muhammad Ali was passing, you cannot do this because it's anti-competitive, and which we should note too that TKO, the parent company of the UFC, wants to get rid of because their amazing ability to promote means they have to get rid of these provisions that say you cannot engage in these actions that are anti-competitive. They have to remove them so they could use their incredible promoting ability to move into boxing. But I digress. I'll get back to I think you look at all that, and I think the evidence, on top of the fact that the UFC has 90% of the revenue, that they have 90% of the top 10 fighters. So if we're talking about elite MMA, or we're just talking about the revenue generated in MMA overall, I think you add that together and it says, yes, the UFC has market power. That market power is monopoly and monopsony. And you put that together, that means fighters have very little options. Fighters have very little leverage to get higher pay. So they're stuck at the pay level they are. Because fighters have very little leverage, their access to the sport is limited, and in management, instead of serving the fighter because there's nowhere else to go to make vast sums of money to make it worthwhile to piss off one promoter and leverage it for the most pay possible, fighters management now decided that it's in our interest to serve this entity that dominates the sport, that dominates 90% of the revenue in the market, to serve them by finding fighters for them, by serving their interest. And for that, we get a small piece of all the fighters we bring in's revenue. And fail at their fiduciary duties. So yes, again, long-winded answer. You're 100% right. It's the fact that the UFC is so big and vast that probably creates a lot of these other problems.
Corey Anderson had a complaint about the UFC. He told fans on a live stream that he remembered when Hunter Campbell told him that he absolutely deserved a title shot, but that he would not get one because his social media numbers weren't there. What's your take on that?
Well, I was not privy to the conversation, so I do not know how accurate his memory is here. I do think it's very conceivable or plausible that Hunter Campbell said something like that.
To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!